twin sisters from the Old West inherited a strange but valuable object from their father. The sun hung low over the dusty horizon of Redemption Creek, Arizona, casting long shadows across the weathered wooden buildings that lined the main street. It was the autumn of 1879, and the town had seen better days. The silver mine that once brought prosperity had run dry 3 years prior, leaving behind only memories and stubborn souls too attached to the land to leave. Among those souls were 23-year-old twin sisters, Charlotte and Caroline Whitmore, whose golden blonde hair caught the last rays of sunlight as they stood outside the undertaker's office, their faces etched with grief and confusion. Their father, Ezekiel Whitmore, had been a respected clockmaker and inventor, known throughout the territory for his peculiar devices and eccentric ways. He had raised the girls alone after their mother died, giving birth to them, teaching them not only to read and write, which was rare enough for women in those parts, but also the intricate mechanisms of gears, springs, and pendulums. The old man had passed away just 3 days ago, found slumped over his workbench with a strange smile on his weathered face, as if he had finally solved some great mystery. The lawyer, a thin man named Cornelius Finch with spectacles that constantly slid down his pointed nose, cleared his throat and adjusted his papers. He had summoned the sisters to his cramped office above the general store to read the will. Charlotte, the elder by 17 minutes and the more practical of the two, sat straight-backed in a wooden chair, her calico dress neatly pressed despite their mourning. Caroline, more dreamy and curious by nature, fidgeted with the lace on her sleeve, her mind already wandering to what strange inheritance their father might have left them. Mr. Finch read through the formalities in a monotone voice, listing their father's meager possessions. The workshop and all its tools would go to them, as would the small house they had grown up in at the edge of town. There were a few dollars in the bank, barely enough to cover the funeral expenses. But then the lawyer paused, removed his spectacles, and cleaned them carefully before continuing. He explained that Ezekiel had left specific instructions about a particular item, something he kept locked in an iron safe behind a false wall in his workshop. The key, Mr. Finch said, had been left in his care with strict orders that it only be given to the girls after his death, and only when they were alone. That evening, as the oil lamps flickered in the workshop that smelled of metal and wood shavings, Charlotte and Caroline stood before the safe they had never known existed. The false wall had been cleverly concealed behind a tall shelf of clock parts. Charlotte inserted the ornate brass key, her hands trembling slightly, and turned it until they heard a satisfying click. The heavy door swung open with a creak, revealing darkness within. Caroline reached in carefully, her fingers touching something wrapped in soft velvet cloth. She pulled it out, and together the sisters unwrapped the mysterious object. What they found was a pocket watch, but unlike any timepiece they had ever seen, and they had seen hundreds in their father's workshop. It was larger than a typical pocket watch, about the size of a woman's palm, crafted from an unusual metal that seemed to shift between silver and gold depending on how the light hit it. The face was covered with not one but 3 sets of hands, each moving at different speeds. The numbers around the rim were not the standard 1 through 12, but rather strange symbols they didn't recognize, though something about them felt ancient and meaningful. Most peculiar of all was that the watch seemed to emit a faint warmth, almost as if it were alive, and when they listened closely, they could hear it ticking in a rhythm that seemed to match their own heartbeat. Tucked beneath where the watch had rested was a letter, sealed with their father's wax stamp. Charlotte broke the seal and unfolded the yellowed paper. Their father's familiar handwriting covered the page, though his hand seemed shakier than usual. He began by apologizing for keeping secrets from them, explaining that what he was about to reveal would sound impossible, but that they must trust him. He wrote that the watch was no ordinary timepiece, but rather an instrument of extraordinary power. It was, he claimed, a time recovery watch, capable of restoring lost time to whoever possessed it. The letter explained that Ezekiel had discovered the watch 30 years ago while prospecting in the mountains, buried in a cave that bore markings suggesting it was far older than any native settlement in the region. He had spent decades studying it, learning its secrets through careful experimentation. The watch, according to his notes, could return hours, days, even years to a person's life, reversing the effects of aging and fatigue, healing wounds, and undoing damage that time had inflicted. But it came with limitations and dangers. Each use drained something from the watch itself, and Ezekiel confessed he didn't fully understand what powered it or how many uses it had left. More troubling, he warned that others had sought the watch over the years, dangerous people who would stop at nothing to possess it. Caroline's voice wavered as she read the final paragraph aloud. Their father urged them to keep the watch secret, to use it sparingly and only when absolutely necessary. He suggested they might use it to help others, but warned against greed or frivolous use. Most importantly, he stressed that they must never let it fall into the wrong hand. He had protected it his whole life, he wrote, often at great personal cost, and now that duty fell to them. He ended the letter by saying he loved them more than all the time in the world, and that he hoped they would forgive him for burdening them with this responsibility. The sisters sat in stunned silence, the watch resting between them on their father's scarred workbench. Charlotte, ever the skeptic, suggested it might be their father's grief and loneliness talking, that perhaps his mind had failed him in his final years. But Caroline picked up the watch, feeling its unusual warmth, watching the strange hands move across the mysterious symbols, and felt in her bones that every word was true. She reminded Charlotte of all the oddities they had witnessed growing up. Their father never seemed to age the way others did, always looking younger than his years. He could work for days without sleeping. When inspiration struck, small injuries healed impossibly fast. Perhaps, Caroline suggested, he had been using the watch on himself all along. Their debate was interrupted by a sharp knock at the workshop door. Both sisters jumped, and Charlotte quickly rewrapped the watch and tucked it into her dress pocket. She called out to ask who was there, and a man's voice answered, smooth and educated, not the rough drawl common to Redemption Creek. He introduced himself as Dr. Marcus Aldridge, recently arrived from Boston, and said he had known their father and wished to pay his respects. Something in his tone made Charlotte hesitate, but Caroline, more trusting, moved to open the door. The man who entered was perhaps 40 years old, impeccably dressed in a black suit that was far too fine for a frontier town, with dark hair slicked back and eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the workshop in a single sweeping glance. He expressed his condolences with practiced ease, speaking of Ezekiel as a brilliant mind ahead of his time. But as he talked, his eyes kept darting around the room, searching, and the sisters realized with growing unease that this was no social call. When Charlotte politely but firmly told him they were in mourning and wished to be alone, something cold flashed across his features before the sympathetic mask returned. He apologized for intruding and left, but not before his gaze lingered on the safe, its door still hanging open. The moment he was gone, the sisters locked the workshop door and looked at each other with dawning fear. Charlotte insisted they hide the watch immediately, somewhere no one would think to look. Caroline suggested they first test it, to know for certain what they possessed. After a heated whispered argument, they compromised. They would test it once, carefully, and then hide it. But test it on what? Charlotte looked around the workshop and spotted a wilted flower in a vase on the windowsill, something their father had picked days before his death. It was brown and dried, its petals fallen. Caroline held the watch up to the flower, and instinctively pressed the crown, the winding mechanism, once. What happened next would forever change their understanding of the world. The watch grew warm in Caroline's hand, almost hot, and one of the three hands began to spin backward rapidly. A faint golden light emanated from the watch face, growing brighter until it formed a thin beam that touched the dead flower. Before their astonished eyes, the flower began to transform. The brown faded to green, the wilted petals straightened and filled with color, and within moments the flower looked as fresh as the day it had been picked. The light faded, the watch cooled, and the backward spinning hand slowly returned to its original position. Both sisters stood speechless, the impossible made real before them. But their wonder was cut short by the sound of breaking glass. Someone had smashed the workshop's side window. Charlotte grabbed a wrench from the workbench as two men climbed through, rough characters with scarves covering the lower halves of their faces. One was tall and lanky, the other built like a barrel with fists like ham-hock. They demanded the watch, and the larger one added with a cruel laugh that Dr. Aldridge sent his regards. He promised if they handed it over peacefully, no one would get hurt. If they refused, well, accidents happened all the time in these parts. Charlotte raised the wrench defiantly, but Caroline pulled her back. Her mind raced through options as her heart pounded. They were outnumbered, outmatched, and trapped. But then an idea formed, risky and desperate. She whispered urgently to Charlotte, whose eyes widened but then narrowed with understanding. Caroline clutched the watch and twisted the crown while pressing it in a specific way, a combination their father's letter had mentioned but warned against using. The watch grew burning hot and all three hands began spinning wildly. The golden light burst forth not in a beam but in a wave that filled the entire workshop. Time itself seemed to stutter and bend. The two intruders froze mid-step, expressions of confusion on their visible faces. Then, impossibly, they began moving backward, retracing their steps in reverse. They climbed back out the window, which repaired itself, the broken glass flowing back together like water. The sisters felt a strange pulling sensation, as if they were being stretched, but they remained aware, watching the world move in reverse around them. The workshop door, which they had locked, unlocked itself. They saw Dr. Aldridge walking backward out of the workshop, his earlier visit undone. Minutes rewound, and finally the effect stopped with a jolt that left both sisters gasping. They found themselves standing in the workshop hours earlier, just before they had opened the safe. But they retained their memories of what had happened, or rather, what would have happened. The watch in Caroline's hand was no longer warm but cold, frighteningly cold, and two of the three hands had stopped moving entirely. Only the central hand continued its steady ticking. Charlotte understood immediately that using the watch in such a way had nearly exhausted it. Their father's warnings echoed in their minds. They had saved themselves but at tremendous cost to the artifact. Now they faced an impossible decision. They knew what was coming. Dr. Aldridge would arrive soon, followed by his thugs breaking in tonight. They could run, leave Redemption Creek, and try to disappear into the vast territories to the west. But Charlotte reminded Caroline that their father had spent his life protecting the watch, had died protecting it, and running would only delay the inevitable. Men like Aldridge would never stop searching. Caroline suggested an alternative that terrified Charlotte but might be their only real chance. They would set a trap, use their knowledge of what was to come to turn the tables on their enemies. The sisters worked quickly, preparing the workshop. They moved the safe to a more visible location, making it appear as if they had just opened it and were examining the contents. They hid rope, tools, and other items they might need in strategic locations. Most importantly, Caroline penned a quick letter explaining everything they knew and addressed it to the town marshal, Sheriff Thomas Bridger, a fair man who had been friends with their father. They left the letter where it would be found if anything went wrong. Then they waited, and right on schedule, Dr. Aldridge knocked on the door. This time, the sisters were ready. They greeted him with false warmth, and Caroline even invited him in, playing the naive young woman while Charlotte pretended to be the protective sister. They let him see the open safe, let his eyes light up with greed. Caroline mentioned innocently that their father had left them a peculiar old watch, but they weren't sure what to do with it. She even retrieved it from the workbench where they had deliberately placed it, letting him see it briefly before Charlotte snatched it away, admonishing Caroline for showing strangers their inheritance. The performance was perfect, and Aldridge's mask of civility slipped further. He made his excuses and left, but the sisters could see the calculation in his eyes. That night, they didn't barricade themselves in the workshop but instead hid in the shadows outside, watching. Sure enough, as midnight approached, two familiar figures crept toward the building. But this time, the sisters were predators, not prey. As the thugs broke the window and climbed through, Charlotte and Caroline, having grown up in a harsh frontier town and taught by their father to defend themselves, were ready. They had set a tripwire inside connected to a bucket of nails that crashed down, startling the intruders. In the confusion, Charlotte swung a board, catching the larger man behind the knees and dropping him. Caroline, despite her dreamy nature, proved she had her father's quick thinking, using a rope to snare the lankier man's feet. The element of surprise gave them precious seconds. Charlotte had already sent word to Sheriff Bridger through a young boy they trusted, and within minutes they heard the marshal's voice calling out, responding to reports of a disturbance. The two thugs, realizing they were caught, tried to flee but found themselves tangled in the sisters' traps and surrounded by the sheriff and his deputies. Under questioning, fear loosening their tongues, they confessed that Dr. Marcus Aldridge, if that was even his real name, had hired them. He had been hunting for Ezekiel's watch for years, having heard rumors of its power through secretive circles of collectors and obsessives who sought objects of supernatural origin. Sheriff Bridger, skeptical but respectful of the sisters and the memory of their father, agreed to bring Aldridge in for questioning. But when they went to the hotel where the supposed doctor had been staying, they found his room abandoned, cleared out in haste. He had vanished like smoke, but he had left behind papers and notes that revealed the frightening scope of his obsession. There were references to an organization, never named directly but called simply the Collective, dedicated to finding and controlling objects like the watch. There were mentions of other artifacts scattered across the world, each with reality-defying properties. Most chilling were drawings of the watch, incredibly detailed, suggesting Aldridge had been searching for it for a very long time. In the days that followed, life in Redemption Creek slowly returned to normal, though the sisters knew nothing would ever truly be normal again. They held a proper funeral for their father, and the whole town turned out, sharing stories of Ezekiel's kindness and brilliance. The workshop became theirs officially, and they made a show of continuing his clockmaking business, but the time recovery watch remained hidden, this time in a place no one would ever think to look, concealed within the very foundations of their home. Charlotte and Caroline spent long nights discussing what to do with their burden. The watch still functioned, but barely. The two hands that had stopped after Caroline's desperate use of its power to reverse time remained frozen. Only the central hand moved, and even that seemed slower than before. Their father's letter had warned that the watch's power was finite, and they had used up much of what remained. They debated whether they should ever use it again, whether the risk of attracting more attention from the Collective and others like Aldridge was worth any benefit the watch might provide. Their answer came 2 months later when a fire broke out at the schoolhouse on a Sunday morning. The building, old and dry, went up in flames with terrifying speed. Most of the people inside escaped, but the schoolteacher, Miss Emma Hartwell, a kind woman in her 60s who had taught half the town to read, had gone back in to make sure no child was left behind. She didn't come back out. The volunteer fire brigade arrived too late to save her. Her body was recovered, burned and broken, and the whole town mourned. At her funeral, Charlotte and Caroline looked at each other across the grave and shared an unspoken understanding. That night, in secret, they took the watch to the undertaker's, where Miss Hartwell's body lay prepared for burial. This was a greater test than the flower, and a far more dangerous use of the watch's power, but both sisters agreed it was right. Caroline held the watch over the teacher's body and pressed the crown once, gently, with a prayer on her lips. The watch grew warm again, and the central hand began to turn backward. The golden light emerged, softer than before, almost gentle, and bathed the dead woman's form. For long minutes nothing seemed to happen, and the sisters feared they had waited too long, that death was beyond even the watch's power to reverse. But then, impossibly, color began to return to Miss Hartwell's gray skin. Burns faded. bones knit together with sounds like distant whispers. And finally, miraculously, the woman's eyes fluttered open. Miss Hartwell's recovery was declared a miracle by the town doctor, who could offer no medical explanation for how someone so clearly dead had returned to life. He suggested she hadn't been as far gone as they thought, though he himself seemed unconvinced by his own words. The schoolteacher herself remembered nothing after entering the burning building, as if she had fallen asleep and awakened in the undertaker's back room, confused but alive. Charlotte and Caroline accepted the town's gratitude silently, never revealing the truth. But when they returned home and examined the watch, they found that the central hand, the last one still moving, had slowed considerably. By their estimate, it had perhaps a half-dozen uses left before it would stop forever. Word of Miss Hartwell's miraculous recovery spread beyond Redemption Creek, carried by travelers and merchants. The story grew in the telling, as stories do, becoming more dramatic and supernatural with each retelling. Most people dismissed it as frontier superstition or religious fervor, but there were others who paid close attention. The sisters began to notice strangers in town, people who asked too many questions, who seemed too interested in Ezekiel's workshop and his daughters. They varied their routines, never keeping to a predictable schedule, and they learned to spot watchers in the crowd. 3 months after the schoolhouse fire, a woman arrived in Redemption Creek riding alone, which was unusual enough to draw attention. She was perhaps 30 years old, dressed in practical traveling clothes, with auburn hair pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat and intelligent green eyes that missed nothing. She introduced herself as Catherine Morrison, a journalist from San Francisco writing about the territories and the people who lived in them. She expressed interest in interviewing the Whitmore sisters about their father's work and their experience taking over his business. Charlotte was immediately suspicious, but Caroline, perhaps seeing something genuine in the woman's demeanor, agreed to speak with her. Over coffee in the general store, Catherine Morrison revealed herself to be far more than a journalist. She explained quietly that she too had experienced an encounter with it. Impossible, with an object that defied natural law. She had spent years researching similar occurrences, collecting accounts of artifacts with inexplicable properties. She had heard rumors of the collective, though she knew them by a different name, and she warned the sisters that such organizations were patient and persistent. If the sisters possessed something extraordinary, and she strongly suspected they did based on the details of Miss Hartwell's recovery, then they would never be truly safe while the collective existed. Catherine proposed an alliance of sorts. She had connections, resources, and knowledge that could help protect them. In return, she asked only for their trust and, if they ever chose to reveal the truth about what they possessed, the opportunity to document it. She promised absolute discretion, and she offered proof of her sincerity by sharing information about 2 other individuals who possessed similar artifacts, though she wouldn't reveal their identities without permission. One had a compass that always pointed toward whatever the holder most desired. Another had a mirror that showed not reflections but possible futures. Both individuals lived in secret, constantly moving, forever looking over their shoulders. The sisters debated Catherine's offer for several days. Charlotte remained skeptical, suspecting a trap, but Caroline pointed out that they were already isolated and vulnerable. Having an ally, especially one with knowledge of this strange hidden world they had stumbled into, might be their best chance at survival. Eventually, they agreed to a cautious partnership. They didn't tell Catherine about the watch's specific abilities, not yet, but they acknowledged that their father had left them something unusual, something that others sought. Catherine accepted this partial truth and immediately began teaching them techniques for staying hidden and safe. Months turned into a year and then 2. The sisters became skilled at living double lives. To Redemption Creek, they were simply the Whitmore twins, the capable young women who ran their father's clock shop and occasionally helped with town events. But in secret, they guarded one of the most powerful objects in existence. They used the watch only twice more in those years, once to save a child who had fallen into the river and drowned, and once to restore a crop field devastated by locusts, buying a desperate farming family another season to survive. Each use took its toll on the watch. The central hand moved slower and slower, and sometimes it seemed to pause entirely before continuing. Catherine Morrison became a true friend, visiting Redemption Creek several times each year under various pretexts. She brought news of the wider world and warnings when she heard whispers of people searching for unusual objects in Arizona territory. Through her, the sisters learned that Dr. Aldridge, whose real name was Marcus Thorne, was indeed a high-ranking member of the collective. He had been disgraced within the organization for his failure to secure the watch and had become obsessed with redemption through its acquisition. Catherine warned that he would eventually return, probably with more resources and a better plan. That prediction came true in the spring of 1882. The sisters were now 26 years old, still young but hardened by years of vigilance. They had received a telegram from Catherine warning that Thorne had been spotted in New Mexico, moving north. A week later, a U.S. Marshal arrived in Redemption Creek with a warrant for the sisters' arrest. The charges were absurd, claiming they had stolen property belonging to a Boston museum, property that Marcus Thorne just happened to be representing. The marshal, a stern man named Dalton who seemed genuinely convinced of their guilt, announced his intention to take them into custody and transport them to Santa Fe for trial. Charlotte recognized immediately that this was Thorne's new approach. He would use the law itself to separate them from their home and support, to isolate them where the collective could act without witnesses. She tried to explain that the charges were false, that Marcus Thorne was a dangerous criminal, but Marshal Dalton had official paperwork from territorial judges, and he was a man who respected the law above all else. He gave them until morning to gather their things, posting a deputy outside their house to ensure they didn't flee. It seemed Thorne had won through patience and manipulation what he couldn't achieve through violence. That night, the sisters held a desperate conference. They could run, but where? They were known now, documented, and fleeing would make them appear guilty. They could fight, but that would only bring more law enforcement down upon them and possibly get innocent people hurt. Caroline suggested using the watch one final time, to reverse time far enough to prevent Marshal Dalton from arriving, but Charlotte reminded her that such use had nearly destroyed the watch before. They might erase the current threat but leave themselves completely defenseless when Thorne made his next move. They seemed trapped with no good options. Their salvation came from an unexpected source. Catherine Morrison arrived in the middle of the night, having ridden hard from Santa Fe when she learned of the warrant. She brought with her a man, elderly and distinguished, who introduced himself as Judge Samuel Cartwright, a territorial judge and, as he quietly explained, someone who had once possessed an artifact of power himself before it was stolen by the collective. He had been fighting them from within the system for years, using his position to quietly obstruct their operations when possible. Catherine had contacted him, and together they had uncovered the truth about the warrant. It had been issued based on falsified evidence and testimony from Marcus Thorne, who had posed as a museum representative. With Judge Cartwright's influence, the warrant could be withdrawn, but that would only buy time. Thorne would try again, through different means. The judge proposed a bold solution. He would arrange for the sisters to be declared dead, victims of a tragic accident. With the help of Marshal Dalton, who Judge Cartwright trusted and would bring into their confidence, they could stage a convincing scene. The sisters would then disappear, given new identities and passage to a distant place where the collective's reach was weaker. It was a drastic measure, requiring them to abandon everything they knew, everyone they cared about, but it might be their only chance at a life free from constant threat. The judge explained that others who possessed artifacts had done the same, going underground and living quietly, guardians of impossible things in a world that would never understand. Charlotte and Caroline looked at their modest home, the workshop filled with their father's tools and their own memories. They thought of the town that had been their entire world, the people who knew them and depended on them. The price of safety was abandonment of identity, of home, of history. It seemed impossibly cruel. But as they held the time recovery watch, feeling its faint warmth and hearing its stuttering tick, they understood their responsibility. Their father had given his life to protecting this object and its power. They couldn't let it fall into the collective's hands, couldn't let Thorn win. Sometimes the bravest thing wasn't to fight but to disappear. The staged accident was elaborate and convincing. A workshop fire, started deliberately but carefully controlled, with 2 bodies provided by the undertaker from unclaimed corpses, dressed in the sisters' clothing and burned beyond recognition. Marshal Dalton officially reported the tragic deaths of Charlotte and Caroline Whitmore, victims of an accident while working with chemicals in their late father's workshop. The town mourned. Sheriff Bridger gave a touching eulogy at their funeral, never knowing the truth. Miss Emma Hartwell, whose life they had saved, wept genuine tears. And Marcus Thorne, watching from a distance, believed he had failed utterly, that the watch had been destroyed in the flames that consumed its guardians. But on a train heading west toward California, 2 young women traveled under the names Sarah and Catherine Miller, sisters from Kansas seeking new opportunities in Sacramento. They carried very little with them, just a single trunk of clothes, some money carefully saved, and a pocket watch wrapped in velvet, hidden in a secret compartment built into the trunk's false bottom. The watch still ticked, barely, slowly, its power nearly exhausted but not quite gone. Charlotte, now Sarah, and Caroline, now Catherine, watched the Arizona territory disappear behind them, everything they had known receding into memory and distance. Their new life in Sacramento was quiet by design. They found work as seamstresses, then saved enough to open a small dress shop. They made friends carefully, never getting too close, always maintaining the fiction of their Kansas origins. Catherine Morrison visited occasionally, now posing as their cousin, bringing news of the world they had left behind. The collective had apparently turned its attention elsewhere, convinced the watch was destroyed. Marcus Thorne had disappeared, some said driven mad by his failure, others claimed he was dead. Judge Cartwright continued his quiet war against the collective from his position in the territorial courts. And in Redemption Creek, a monument had been erected in the town square, commemorating Ezekiel Whitmore and his daughters, brilliant minds lost too soon. Years passed. The sisters built a comfortable life, always alert but gradually learning to relax their guard. They used the watch only once more, a decade after their staged deaths, when Catherine Morrison arrived desperately ill with pneumonia that doctors said would kill her within days. They restored their friend's health, and in doing so, the watch's central hand finally stopped moving. The time recovery watch had given its last gift. It was now just an object, beautiful and mysterious but powerless, its energy expended through years of use. The sisters kept it anyway, a reminder of their father, their sacrifice, and their purpose. By 1895, Charlotte and Caroline Whitmore, still known as Sarah and Catherine Miller to everyone who knew them, were successful businesswomen in their late 30s. Their dress shop had expanded into one of the finest in Sacramento, and they had even published a book on clockwork mechanisms under pseudonyms, honoring their father's legacy in the only way they could. They sometimes wondered what their lives might have been if they had never opened that safe, never discovered the watch, never learned about the collective and the hidden world of impossible artifacts. But they couldn't regret the choice. They had saved lives, protected something precious, and survived against overwhelming odds. On quiet evenings, they would sometimes take out the watch and study it, tracing the strange symbols on its face, feeling the now cold metal that once pulsed with warmth and power. They wondered about its origin, about who made it and why, questions their father had spent a lifetime pondering without finding answers. They wondered if there were other watches like it somewhere in the world, or if it had been unique. Most of all, they wondered if they had done right, if the sacrifices had been worth it, if their father would be proud of how they had carried his burden. The watch offered no answers, silent now as any ordinary timepiece. But in their hearts, Charlotte and Caroline believed they had honored their father's legacy in the way he would have wished, by choosing protection over power, secrecy over fame, and life over greed. And perhaps that was answer enough.